Good evening. Today I'll be doing my presentation on debt, productivity, and social stability in the United States. First, I'd like to give several key terms. The first will be debt. Debt is both a necessity and a curse. The reasons for this will be governmental and corporate. For government debt, it's most usually during some times of military excursions, structural governmental issues regarding the budget, immediate infrastructure projects, or some sort of natural disaster. For example, back in the early 1700s, England sought to solve a revenue crisis by creating a company called the South Sea Company, they traded with several ports in the Southern Hemisphere. The company was generally unprofitable, but it created a lot of enthusiasm after the successes of the VOC and some other, and the British East India Company. What's interesting about this company is that although it created an initial rise in stocks and enough funds for the government purse, after the company lost value, the government had to pay off a significant amount of debt that it had incurred that it had no ways of creating revenue for. It is, even today, in 2010, I believe, they paid off their last debt payment for the South Sea bubble, if it was their last. I'm not entirely sure. Today, the United States debt exceeds our GDP. This is pre-crisis numbers. Pre-crisis numbers is 23 trillion, and our GDP was estimated at about 22 trillion. But debt, for corporate purposes, is equally interesting. Now, corporate players, when they enact in debt, have the ability to be private actors. Their actions are of less consequences in many cases. But for a private player in debt, it is more likely that they'll be using the debt for investment purposes. Or if they have a significant amount of trust, they might be using it for some sort of income scheme, but this is extremely unlikely. It's usually for investment, and usually debt allows productivity growth. If debt is incurred that does not exceed future revenue, a economic crisis occurs for that company and the player is equally dealt with. This cannot occur for a government. When a government enacts debt it cannot repay, it must reshape its social standing, which of course is incredibly risky and leads to higher interest rates. There is a reason why German interest payments are exceedingly low compared to that of a country like Mexico, which defaulted a series of times in the 1990s. But debt allows for productivity. Now, productivity is in many ways a true cause of economic growth. If a government is willing to spend money in rapid infrastructure projects, this will cause an immediate multiplier effect wherein economic growth occurs, but in the long term, it is productivity that almost always causes a serious amount of tangible long-term economic growth, and often short-term as well. Take, for example, the Netherlands from 1650 to 1750, especially in regards to their transport industry. In the early 1650s, and for the very beginning of the 1700s, the Netherlands was able to have a well-equipped transport system, where by digging canals that would pull ships with large cargo across landways and bogs, they could travel 15 miles per hour, incredibly slow for our time. And if any company was to do that in modern days, they would lose an enormous amount of value, or they would have to raise their prices. But what's interesting is that when English observers at the time note how incredibly fast this transit wave is, and it's one of the reasons that the Netherlands was able to gain such economic prosperity. Not the sole reason, but one of many. When England, by the 1750s, perfects their interior road system and can travel 30 miles per hour, it's still an incredibly slow number. But because of the comparable advantage, that it helps England establish economic growth across its territories. The problem with productivity and debt is social stability. Debt helps to create productivity growth, but productivity and debt can help unweave a social standing. Take, for example, Arkhangelsk and St. Petersburg. Before the establishment of St. Petersburg, Arkhangelsk was the primary sector for Russian timber exports, and the North Sea is an Arctic territory, very closed off, very cold for most of the year, only open for a couple of months. But it was the primary sector. It's far away from Europe, but it's better than going through sea lanes in the Black Sea controlled by Turkish fleets. When Peter the Great establishes St. Petersburg in 1703, this city and the timber lanes were able to go open for a couple more months than previously, and they were also able to export more amounts of timber because of this, which causes economic growth, but it also causes at least the short-term deterioration of the city's wealth. So social stability can be threatened in this way. Think of Nokia, which is a primary Finnish company, versus that of an iPhone. Right? When the iPhone takes over, Nokia loses a lot of its value, and so too does it lose its value in Finland. So that issue is creative destruction. It's created first by Joseph Schumpeter as a term, and who thought that the creative destructive nature of capitalism was its primary element that defined it. For example, back to that Nokia iPhone example, both players are self-interested. Both players want to create the superior product, and the player that does will replace the old product. Think of DVDs versus records. Think flashcards versus floppy disks. Think of the cloud. All these technological advances occur because of the self-interests of those who create it. But as a result, there are no longer telephone operators in the United States. A significant industry at the time was employing young women. One of my aunts was actually a telephone operator. And eventually her job became obsolete because new technology emerged that allowed the economy to become more productive and efficient. So there's this aspect of capitalism that is inherently destructive towards itself in terms of long-term growth. The exact same example of Arkhangelsk and St. Petersburg can be made repeatedly throughout history. And this place that becomes more effective, more efficient, grows in prosperity. It's not necessarily evil, it's a force of markets. When the Hudson Dam, the river project, began, that connected the Hudson Canal between Lake Erie and the Hudson River all the way to New York was constructed. New mills were able to pop up and compete with each other, and the price of bread, flour, the exportation of wheat from the north to the south of New York, it dropped dramatically. And this fuels a rise in industrial development because all of a sudden there's these port cities on rivers that could never supported themselves before because it was too far out of the way. And these companies compete with each other. And eventually some cities become obsolete. When Detroit suddenly is less productive than factories in China, Detroit loses its industry. Natural gas is a great example. Over the last 50 years, coal and natural gas have competed with each other, but natural gas has never had a technological edge that allows it to establish itself. This vast gas field underneath the United States plains and mountains was untapped. Today, in 2015, natural gas surpassed coal production for the first time in United States history. It's over 35% of our United States energy market. Natural gas has a tangible factor. It is cleaner than coal. One university study suggests that with natural gas we can save 483 million gallons of water per year if we use it. But 13% of coal comes from West Virginia. Most of Virginia's economy is based around coal. Even though they have a natural gas field, it hasn't really been developed yet. With these coal towns that are no longer vibrant, no longer necessary for the U.S. energy grid, they will become obsolete. This is the social stability that threatens the government. When your job becomes obsolete, you have two options. You can either adapt or you perish. And sometimes cities perish. There are some studies that suggest that over 50% of jobs transitioning occur through creative destruction. So what has been done to address this? Well, the primary mode for our United States government, for most of our history, has been laissez-faire economics, which is, there's a story about laissez-faire and where it got its name. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the French minister that managed the economy during the reign of Louis XVI, was asked business leaders, what he could do to promote the economy, and they said, let us be, let us do. And that is what this, that is what laissez-faire translates to. Leave us alone, essentially. It's the economic idea of the government not intervening in the economy in any way, shape, or form. It's been promoted by some, such as Adam Smith, but but in the United States form, there's very little government interference except for something such as railways. The next one is Keynesianism. Keynesianism emerges in the Great Depression era, and its mode of thought is that depressions occur because of an absence of demand. So to prevent depression, one must adjust monetary influences and monetary banking policies along with government spending to create artificial demand. If inflation occurs, other factors can be used. This is the ideal behind projects such as the New Deal, even though Keynes took a lot of his influence from projects such as the New Deal. And the final one has been used on a very small scale in the United States compared to other countries, but it is that of economic planning. It's the idea the market's inefficient for the government's needs, for the people's needs, and the state can best plan to avoid market inefficiencies. Some of the most productive periods in the United States economic history have been towards World War I and World War II, but it's not a long-term factor. In the United States, in both these periods of time, debt increases dramatically. Most of the debt incurred by President Roosevelt occurred during World War II. Same thing for Wilson. Wilson was running a balanced budget until the next year. He suddenly had one of the largest deficits in United States history because of economic planning. It's also key to note that during this period of time, there's rationing. There's rationings of goods and services. So each of these ideas is more complex than has been described here, but these are generally what's been done in the past to promote economic efficiency, general stability, debt, productivity, in some way, shape, or form. Now here are my solutions. So I'll go through 10 economic ideals that merge government and economic concepts, and we'll talk about each one individually. So back to laissez-faire economics. I already touched on it's incredibly influential on libertarians and monetarists, but it doesn't necessarily encompass their beliefs. Laissez-faire economics does not necessarily state that the government cannot interfere in any context. They promote government infrastructure, for example, roads, canals. That's not a negative sign to laissez-faire economics, is that the government won't interfere with that. They want a country stable enough to promote law and justice, military services. But after that, laissez-faire economics is incredibly hands-off. There's the idea that the market will self-regulate in all cases. And it's useful to note that in the context of where it's created, England, there was not free markets. There were incredibly high tariffs. There were high barriers to trade. In France, it was purported by the physiocrats who believed in this model. They're slightly different in belief, but they take a lot of their laissez-faire inspirations from the physiocrats. They had internal tariffs between one French province to the next. It was not an efficient market. So the government has this job of military property rights, limited infrastructure projects. Great. What are its impacts? We can find that laissez-faire economics do not believe in deficit spending unless it's for a purpose such as military, defense of the country. But, so effectively, for most periods of time, the government will run effectively sound budgets. This is the ideal. Laissez-faire economics generally support free trade as well. It's very hard to find some that don't. John Stuart Mill thought that laissez-faire economics in terms of free trade would end great suffering and mass starvation because it would repeal the corn laws, which prevented the importation of cheap grain from the United States and Canada to promote English farmers' nobility interest. And he's right. In this period of time, after the corn laws are repealed, there's a great increase in the supply of grain in free trade. Interestingly, to support this model, after the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, productivity in low productivity plants on both sides increased to 15%. And the productivity for high productivity firms that were already productive, increased 14% because they were able to exchange effectively. This effectively created a surplus of jobs that were lost. But it has its downside. Laissez-faire economics does not provide any social safety net. If you fail, you fail. If your father is hit by a car and can no longer go to the factory, too bad, kid. You're going to the factory. You have to provide for your family. There's no social safety net. It's free markets. So that same Canada Free Trade Agreement reduced unemployment levels by 12% in low productivity firms. Now there's more jobs created. There's cheaper goods, there's cheaper services, there's better services. Things are more productive. But at the end of the day, there are still some who lose their jobs. So it doesn't account. It accounts for productivity, it accounts for debt, but doesn't necessarily account for social stability. Now we're going to talk about Keynesianism. And Keynesianism is fascinating. We already talked about Keynesianism in regards to his monetary policies and the idea of government debt and infrastructure projects promoting economic growth. Keynes is incredibly influential in things like the Bretton Woods system, and but his system fails in several regards. It's generally efficient for the promotion of employment levels. Productivity, it's arguable. There are some who believe that Keynesianism actually hinders productivity growth. And the reason for this is Keynes doesn't necessarily disagree with free markets. He promotes free markets. He believes free markets and the markets are the best way to promote economic growth and stability in the world. He believes markets promote freedom. But sometimes markets fail. And he wants to prevent the mass depressions that occurred during the 1930s. He dies in 1946, I believe. So he doesn't see the later transition period that he feared would happen, is that people would take as ideas to justify just randomly spending. For example, today, in 1934 to 1941, debt rose $28 billion, which is 164% of the previous debt load. In the stimulus of JFK rose a debt 8%, Johnson 13%. And recent stimulus measures, such as Barack Obama's $1 trillion, have risen, just in 1 year alone, in total it's about $8 trillion over 8 years, have risen the debt dramatically. But it's useful to note that there are some who believe that it's not the amount of debt you incur, it's the amount of debt incurred in relation towards your productivity, towards your GDP. If you took the debt of Britain in the 1750s and you applied it to any advanced economy, they'd be in an incredibly sound financial situation. But Britain was not, necessarily. Britain had high tariffs and taxes they had to pay off a debt they incurred in war. That being said, Keynes is not necessarily focused on increasing productivity because he's a free market advocate, but his ideas of the multiplier effect. Every $1 spent on infrastructure projects nets back, I believe, no, it was welfare, sorry. Every $1 spent on welfare nets the economy $1.74. Every $1 billion spent nets the economy 20,000 jobs. That's just in infrastructure. So there's obviously a promotion of that. In the social aid, it allows investment to the struggling. But the debt and productivity are both arguable and some of its greatest flaws. So this is dirigism. Now dirigism is the sort of state-directed capitalism that we talked about earlier. It's not necessarily only economic planning. There are private actors who are rational in their approach in dirigism. What dirigism is the form of economic model that arrives in France. Now France post-1940s, post-World War II, there's a general belief among both right-wing and left-wing, although the right-wing's party and organizations believed that it was necessary in order to save their economy and use them as a nationalist ideal, while the left wing uses promoting social growth and social cohesion. Dirigism was used to create economic planning across France. And during this period of time, state-owned companies in France from 1946 to 1973 generally either exceed or become focus of national attention. Agriculture expands dramatically. There is a large construction boom. It's a period of time where France really advances its economic skills, but there's a flaw in dirigism. It can cause significant increases in debt, for example. In France, there was government debt remained solvent due to how the central bank caused its policy to enact. The central bank instituted something called credit controls, where they prevented certain credit from being allocated to certain industries in order to prevent inflation. You prevent how much is being lent, you prevent economic growth, you prevent inflation. This is why inflation is pretty steady during this period. But if you have state-owned companies, and you're using them to plan the economy, there's the risk that that economy is not productive because there's no incentive for the economy to be so. Take, for example, the VOC, a state-owned Dutch company back in the 1680 to 1796. The problem with the VOC is that at first it's incredibly productive. It goes into the East, and it's said that the only company that could trade in Japan was the VOC. The company that had a monopoly on Ceylonese elephants, the VOC. They controlled the Spice Islands. They controlled the nutmeg production. They were the center of East Asian trade because they had the incentive to be. But when the English come in and promote a better product, they can't compete. And suddenly the Dutch economy loses its value in the VOC. So if a state-owned company fails, the government has to continually bail them out, which is what the government did. And this ensures a higher cost for the company and for the government. And eventually, it can promote this debt cycle, where companies have to be bailed out by the government, and they become state-owned, or they are state-owned, and eventually the economic model you promoted can fail due to the fact that you couldn't meet your goals. The Soviet Union cannot always meet its goals. It's different than the French model, because the French model does not prevent capitalism. It wants capitalism. It desires capitalism. It desires its planning to enhance capitalism. But this is the problem. And this can be the problem with productivity. Japan had a similar form of dirigism, although they don't call it dirigism. So what happened in this model is that Japanese companies lost their edge. They had a competitive system. They developed a competitive system. They developed competitive companies. But companies such as Toyota, today they still use fax machines. And part of the reason they never switched to email is because corporate culture. Corporate culture and also productivity. Toyota is partly state-owned. And the state has an interest in Toyota succeeding. And if Toyota was to fail, just like if General Motors was to fail, both governments, the US and Japanese, would bail out General Motors or Toyota. So the company has less incentive to invent. This is one of the reasons why the Gangnam areas of South Korea, in which corporations receive generous bailouts from South Korean companies, are both incredibly powerful in South Korea, and sometimes, and usually, inefficient in some way. So dirigism is growth-oriented, and there are historical examples of creating a prosperous society, and so they can be used to promote growth in areas that will not have otherwise experienced growth. There are factories, plastic factories in the south of France that never would have existed if state-owned planning had not existed, but they weren't necessarily productive. This is the flaw. It becomes political. If it can become political, you can have the flaw that your country can't adapt. And that's part of the fear of dirigism. And some would argue that dirigism caused high inflation. But it hasn't. The closest example we can get today would be Chinese economic planning. But even this differs in form. So now we get to the monetarists. And the monetarists are generally libertarians. Milton Friedman is the example I'll take of a monetarist. And he was, if you've ever watched his series Free to Choose, a extreme libertarian. He wanted to take libertarianism as far as he could go, to the limits. He believed that rational actors would know what's best for them. And if they knew what's best for them, they would naturally follow a process with which they would enact their own reality. Governments inherently are flawed and political, so therefore they can't be trusted to make rational decisions. Free agents can. But monetarists are different because they are not laissez-faire. They believe in central banking policies. What they want to do is they want to increase the money supply equal to productivity growth. They want to find productivity growth and only increase monetary prices and money supply by how much productivity grows, because therefore you can't have inflation to such a degree. They believe 2% inflation is the optimal amount, because you have too little of inflation, negative inflation, deflation. You're going to have a depressionary crisis. People are constantly waiting for the lowest prices possible. You have too much inflation, no one will buy, and you're going to have stagnation. they shift the markets from Keynesianism. They're commonly, in the period of time where they're notable, 1960s, 1970s, they end in the United States with 1982, with the end of Paul Volcker. They are rising in influence. But some monetarists do not believe in large budget deficits. They are for smaller government, generally, with the ideals of Milton Friedman. And they're for budget neutrality, at the least, because you have a budget in too much deficit. You can't effectively control interest rates the same way you could. You're going to force credit, the crowding out effect, where government soaks up all the interest, all the available funds that you can't lend them to private corporations. But it's, and it can be productive. Monetarists emphasize private growth and creating long-term economic conditions for success. But just like laissez-faire, they don't have a social safety net. It's the same problem. Milton Friedman had an answer, and his was that the most effective would be a negative income tax. Negative income tax, if someone makes under a certain amount, they're funded by a government a certain wage, to the fact that they have enough to support their income, but not enough to take advantage of a system. But this has never been enacted. There's not many useful steps towards enacting it. It's essentially a UBI. But his is affordable because you're cutting every other social system. Social Security would no longer exist. It's impractical. So now, there are other ideals that we've touched on here. Communism, imperialism, corporatism. There will be other ideologies discussed, but communism has made an impact on the world. And I do believe it needs to be discussed, because if you fail to discuss it, you fail to discuss the ideology and why it fails. Communism here, there are many forms of communism in ideology. The communism that was enacted under Lenin, under Stalin, under Trotsky, under Pol Pot, under Mao, under various dictators, is a planned socialist economy. This is not what Engels and Marx were talking about, but for the purpose of historical discussion, it's the only way we can analyze it. And the ideology of Marx and Engels and their ideas of dialectic materialism have not panned out as a historical trend, and are easily justified when just by looking back at history rather than predicting future events. So we're going to analyze Soviet and Chinese economies, primarily Soviet, as what communism is, which is a state-owned economy where the state owns the means of productions as a planned socialist economy. The difference between this and a dirigist system, although both use economic planning, dirigists promote private markets. Socialists detest the market. They think that the state is the sole way to promote economic growth. So what we find is that Soviet leaders had this dual idea that they wanted to base their economy off. They wanted to base it off the German war economy, where everything was produced for optimal national security reasons. The German state was incredibly efficient at setting fixed prices during World War I, which is where they're looking back from. Fixed prices, high productivity, just because you're forced to produce, and rationing. But they wanted to take the Henry Ford mass factory approach so they could produce the most possible. It wasn't necessarily that there were a lack of boots in the Soviet Union, it was there was a lack of quality boots in the Soviet Union. There was no inducement to produce, at least in the long term. There are stories, this is incredibly unfortunate, of pills in the Soviet Union because the reforms of Khrushchev made it that you produce more pills, you get a higher rate as a worker. The pills would be filled with water instead of medicine. And people would die from this because there was no inducement to produce. The Soviet economy was not efficient. There are stories of the lottery system that the Soviets had. You didn't win an item, you won the right to buy an item. Some people would win the right to buy $2,000 TVs, but the average wage, at the max wage that was ever reached in the Soviet Union was $3,200 per year. It wasn't efficient for an economy. So there was a higher standard of living that occurred because you're mass producing, and there are lots of manufacturing centers that emerge because the emphasis is on manufacturing. But this is where it gets into our issue. Socialist economies did not believe in debt. Debt was a capitalist flaw to them. Debt sowed the seeds of future economic depressions, of the bust for the boom. So for a socialist, you can't enact government debt. You can't just print money because then your prices are meaningless. And often for the Soviet economy, once it was taken off, the Soviets set prices were meaningless. So how do you enact an economy? You ration goods. After World War II, the Soviet Union would strip metal from Polish train lines and use it to fund their industrial productivity. How do you promote resources? Well, you allocate them in a way that you think you can. Right? There's two causes of the Cossack murdering and economic depression and famine in the 1930s, 1920s. The first is that the Cossacks were anti-Soviet. This is primarily in Ukraine. They're anti-Soviet. So this is the first. This is why they're antagonistic. They were primarily the wealthiest farmers in the Union. So the Soviet Union could use them as a scapegoat to peasants who are hungry and starving. They are not. The peasants are. The Cossack farmers were asked to produce more food, but they were doing so while the Soviet economy was taking the food from them. Any food they produced, they could no longer sell on the mass market. They were keeping some for themselves, and as protest, they murdered a significant amount of their cows. Today, the Soviet Union, today, Russia still has a problem with the absence of cows because of the murdering of them that occurred back in the 1920s as a protest. And then Stalin was able to use this as a scapegoat and to promote economic injustice. There was a mass famine where millions died. To promote in growing industrial centers, resources are allocated in ways that often hurt the farmers. And they didn't do it because they had some gain between them. There wasn't self-interest. It was the self-interest of a dictator seeking to assure his place in the world. There's this, the Soviet Union is called the upper Volta with rockets. It's a derogatory term from the 1980s, but in a way there's a truth to it. Because it's, the Soviet Union prioritized military spending in a way that it far outstripped their economic capacities. If you look at world influence during the time of the Soviet Union, it far outstrips their place in the world by economic terms because their economy was based on military terms. There's a strong sense of militarism that doesn't necessarily exist in other countries during this time period. But of course, there's productivity problems. There's stories that during the space race, the Soviet Union established lasers, and they figured out how to make lasers for their space race. But they couldn't use them for other products. It was the United States industrialists who figured out you could use lasers towards producing DVDs and other high-tech products. There's a story that when we went to space, we had spent millions of dollars to develop a space pen that would allow you to use a pen in space. The Soviet Union used a pencil. It's the same idea. The Soviet Union is not a productive economy. They don't have the same high-tech capabilities as we did. So they were inefficient. There was no incentive to produce, just like the pills. There's a book by Friedrich Hayek, called The Road to Serfdom, in which he proposed the idea that the greater authoritarian you are in economic terms, the less free you are in social terms. And this is true for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, everything was condensed into state planning, so the freedom of choice that people had in their lives was absent. You can't move around for your job. You can't, without the Soviet Union's permission. You can't do your profession without the permission of testing boards. You can't, everything you do in your life is determined by higher officials. And this creates social instability. If you promote anti-socialist views, there are chances that you'll be sent to a concentration camp. This is not sound for social stability. It's not sound for productivity. And it's not sound for debt. Because while debt doesn't exist in an economy, you need a new way to account for it. And this is where famines can start. So now we talk about imperialism. So imperialism is the conquest of power by another power for either political, economic, racial, or some sort of nationalist ideology. Imperialism has long roots, and almost every major power in the world has a history with it. The difference in late 1800s imperialism is how it forms. It's in Europeans conquering the world, and they do so for explicitly racist terms, explicitly nationalist terms, and explicitly economic terms. There is no concern with the people of India by the British rulers. If you look at the train systems and how they're built in India, they're built to send cotton directly towards industrial centers so they can send it to England. England will mass produce cotton at cotton factories, and they'll send it back to India at cheaper profits. But there's a story. The British were buying cotton at a higher rate. It's not a story, it's a mass famine. The British were buying cotton at a higher price than the cost of subsistence farming. So farmers start transitioning towards subsistence farming. Towards cotton farming, away from subsistence farming. And when they do so, there's a mass famine because the British have artificially created one in order to fuel their cotton desire to create higher manufacturing of clothing. They needed resources, and they were willing to exploit the people of these regions in order to get them. But they're not always efficient. So Italy, for example, took over Ethiopia as a show of power. They did so in 1936. It caused economic sanctions on them, and they did so because they believed that imperialism could be used to conquer foreign lands, and they'd gain the economic cost, and they'd be thought of as a grand European power. The problem was that it cost more to fund Ethiopia and the battles there and to keep them in line than it did to gain the economic benefits of possessing them. Just because you possess a place doesn't make it efficient. Doesn't mean that you'll have productivity. In many cases, it doesn't mean there's social stability, and you might incur more debt to secure it. So imperialism can become unprofitable if the venture fails, because in many ways, imperialism is a venture. It's a venture to gain resources for your home-based economy. It's a capitalist endeavor in a way, because it's an idea that it has been done by Soviet powers as well. This is one reason that the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, for the resources, for the influence. But it's the idea of gaining these resources and using them. And it doesn't do so in a way of accordance with the self-interest of the people. So in many ways it fails to be capitalist, but it does so to promote the benefit of the few. It can become unprofitable. When the VOC couldn't effectively trade for nutmeg anymore, the VOC became bankrupt. So it's the same as a state-owned company in a way, because you're not privately competing. The individuals of the countries aren't allowed to effectively use their resources. They're not effectively allowed to organize, and they're not effectively allowed to develop industry. They're not effectively allowed to organize themselves to benefit themselves. They're allowed to do so for the benefit of a colonizer. Today, there's more economic gain from the free trade of free nations than there ever has been under the imperial system, because economic rational players are allowed to organize, and it's not as if there's no exploitation today. It's not as if there's no horror, but the amount of horror compared to the imperial system is greatly reduced. When the British left sub-Saharan Africa, immediately afterwards, records found that their average life expectancy of sub-Saharan African man was about 40. 40. When the British, 20 years later, in 1980, life expectancy had dramatically jumped to over 50. The colonization efforts were a harm to both social stability. It caused internal revolt. It was not productive per se. It just allowed the transfusion of resources to economies that were developing. And it could become a risky venture that would bankrupt a country. So now we're at corporatism. Now corporatism is the idea of selectively using specific aspects of an idea, of a society, of a culture, and establishing them into classes and directly representing them in government. It hasn't been used much in history. It resembles feudalism in a way. It's used by Metternich to a certain degree, but he doesn't use it the same way that Mussolini does. Benito Mussolini is one of the first and most prominent of the corporatist ideology. He's obviously using it to promote his own dictatorial goals, his aims, and it's not necessarily certain that corporatism is truly developed in this region. It's not known how much the corporatist influence had, because what happened is he had 22 cabinet positions where both labor and industry leaders from each sector would be represented directly in government, and he would make policy decisions based off their recommendations. It's not known, and it's thought that he played more of an influence than the board did. And it's been used, corporatism and ideology has been used to a degree in Austria, Norway, post-World War II. It's not inherently fascist, it's used by fascists, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily for the benefit of the general good well-being. Think of labor being directly represented by the Labor Department of the United States government. Think of industry being represented by commerce, except to a greater degree. In the Italian example, which is what we will use because it's the most prominent example and the one that fully developed corporatism into the max it has been, there was initial high economic growth, but it's not known how much this is caused by just infrastructure building by Mussolini, war spending, or other factors. And then there's the unfortunate reality that corporatism does not provide lasting gains in this example because of foreign conquest, which drained resources, economic sanctions, and the Great Depression. All of these place a role inside the failure of the economy during the corporatist era. And this causes debate on its role. So in regards to debt, you could theoretically have a government that is not reliant on debt and is corporatist. But in this example, it's not how it played out. With regards to productivity, this is where the argument takes a detour. It's not corporatism creates a system that institutes class among men. It's men instituting classes that then impress men because it creates an idea of what they are. It does not permit the free movement, in a way, of men or workers, because they become part of an ideology, part of a workforce. And this happens in a free state as well, and it doesn't mean that you have to be corporatist. It means that you are losing your rights to vote or become part of society. But it should be noted that the state used corporatism to intervene directly in the economy and use what industry leaders and labor leaders thought was good policy for their industries, which of course is biased, which of course is going to lead directly to the either exploitation of natural resources, to the worse off of society, towards some sort of benefit towards the labor leaders or business leaders. Think of today of the FDA and how many of its members come from drug companies. It allows a place for corruption, and corruption is not productive. Because if corruption exists, it means that things are not occurring based off merit, but based off the value of money. And the value of money in regards to actors who are not supposed to be beholden to their own pocketbooks. So, any economic productivity gain that occurred in this era not necessarily was from these inefficient state-private monopolies used by corporatists, but was for infrastructure projects that improved long-term productivity. And this is the example from this era. For social stability, it creates legal classes in a way, even though it's unofficial. It is representing them officially, and it allows corruption to reign. All of these are inefficient for a government to operate. And now we get to the order liberal. Order liberalism is a very obscure species of economics. It derives itself from a series of German thinkers who were both anti-Nazi, totalitarian, anti-socialist, pro-free market, but they wanted to prevent what they saw as the boom and bust of the 1800s, of the continual rise in economic fortunes and its decay. They were led by economists such as Walter Eucken, who is relatively unknown in most countries besides Germany. He went to jail in the 1940s and 1930s because he was an anti-Nazi. He attended speeches by Friedrich Hayek, and he came to the conclusion that a capitalist society without monopolies, without cartels, could effectively stop the rise of a powerhouse, of a power totalitarian state. And he thought that the boom bust was caused by inefficiencies. He wanted to prevent what he saw as the inflation that had crippled the middle class, which had crippled the middle class during the Weimar Republic. He wanted to establish a system where monopolies couldn't grasp power and hold on to, or where systems could not fail, when power was balanced between them in the way. So his policies, and order liberals' policies in general, he's considered one of many founders, are strong, independent central banks that promote stable inflation and prevent a stable currency. They wanted a valuable currency because they believed foreign imports would allow for greater productivity, which would be the ultimate beneficiaries of society. Then a weak currency, because a weak currency implies that your companies were not efficient without the benefit of having cheap exportation rates. They wanted to prevent cartels, so they established government strong enough to break up cartels, but not someone that would interfere with subsidies. They are not pro-subsidy. They are free marketeers. But what makes the order liberals distinct from laissez-faire or monetarists with strong independent banking practices is that they don't believe in monopolies, and they believe in a social safety net. And they believe in the social safety net because they don't want to see the creative aspects of capitalism, the creative destruction, the ability for markets to erode the system of government from creating the right situations for political powers and political figures to use populism to upset the status quo. So they create a social safety net. So, and they don't believe in debt either. Because, well, they do believe that is necessary. And they do believe that is necessary for governments. It's an essential aspect of capitalism and the state-owned system. But they believe in a government that follows clear rules and must be kept. It's one reason why Germans are obsessed with the notion of low deficits, of high surplus. Because if a government is stable enough to have surplus and to pay down its debt, it is stable enough to purport the rules of society. It's not beholden to foreign creditors. It is not unstable. It does not have fluctuating budgets from year to year. In a crisis, it has the funds it needs to promote economic growth. This is one reason why generally Germany has done a great consistent job of keeping this contract. They have the principle of Haftung, which is liability in German. And it means that those who cause economic pain, social pain, pay for what they've done. And it creates a system of responsibility. And in this way, debt is reduced. Productivity is enhanced because you rely on the free market, you prevent monopolies from eroding productivity, and you prevent governments from interfering. You have strong currencies, imports increase, but so do exports because you're more efficient. And productivity will increase. So you have increasing productivity, decrease in debt, or at least a stability in debt. How do you do with social stability? And what we found is the social stability inequality is very low in Germany because there's an absence of cartels. There's a transfer of wealth between smaller companies and an efficient education system. The education system is aimed towards providing, if not higher education, vocational training to those who will be working in small local companies. And these companies are trusted among society because they consist of 20 to 200 people. And some are larger. There are certainly behemoths in the corporate world from Germany. But there's manageable reputation between these companies and employers. There's a safety net. If you fail, it doesn't mean that the German government will bail you out, but it does mean that you don't feel as if economic pain will destroy the situation you've built for yourself. If your father gets hit with a car tomorrow and he can't go to the factory, your family won't become impoverished. You still have a chance to succeed. That wasn't your fault. Those hurt by market forces are provided social aid in a way that other ideologies don't necessarily account for. And this is where we get the supply-side economics. What's interesting in supply-side economics is that they are partly monetarists. They do believe in productivity growth. They do believe in limited government. What's interesting about supply side economics is that they seek to reduce pressures on the suppliers of goods. Where Keynesianism seeks to create demand that will then be met, supply side seek to reduce the costs for those who produce goods, which will then reduce employment, produce economic growth, allow cheaper importation. They are at a time where inflation is destroying and eroding the manufacturing base, the economies of the Western world, and they believe that if you produce the costs for productivity and the costs for businesses, inflation will decrease, employment will increase, economic growth will increase, and you will escape from this crisis. In some ways, this has worked. There's a debate that occurs between monetarism and supply-side economics about the relative task and the role that they played in limiting the inflation of the 70s as it transitions to the 80s. There's no doubt that the fact that high oil prices affected, and there are some things that the governments could not control that affected the inflation, but it is notable that supply-side economics does have an impact on inflation that is negative and therefore helps reduce inflation. It also helps increase employment. These are, the issue is, to what degree? Now, this has been touched on before, but supply-side economics primarily wants to cut regulations and taxes. Now, the regulations, if done properly, will not become an issue in regards to debt. They will become an issue when you cut taxes. Now, President Reagan cut funding for social programs. He cut taxes dramatically. He raised them in two budgets, but he cut taxes generally to a great degree. And he increased military spending. So while President Reagan, through his supply-side economics, caused the debt to rise 186%, it must be made clear that he did increase the debt. And this does he did increase military spending. And this does create some tension between supply-side economics and Keynesianism, because some Keynesianists feel that the revival of economic industry in the 1980s, post-1981, and the recession that occurred there, was due to increasing government spending. But it is true that for every dollar spent cutting corporate taxes, you will get a return of 50% of that. 50 cents for every dollar cut. It's not efficient. It causes a rise in debt. Supply-side economics does increase employment. The 2003 tax cut resulted in an increase of 0.7% GDP growth per year. And for every dollar cut in taxes, a dollar goes to economic growth. But it may not be as effective as other usages. And that's where the main debate occurs. Now, as regards to social stability, supply-side economics does typically preserve a free market system, laissez-faire. They could be ordoliberal, but they generally have not been. And they could embrace a welfare state, but they generally have not been embracing the welfare state, that is. So, supply-side economics also has an entangling with trickle-down economics. Those who believe in supply-side economics generally believe in trickle-down economics, and this is incredibly controversial. Because trickle-down economics makes the claim that because the richer citizens of society have less taxes, they'll spend more. And because they're spending more, those who need jobs and unemployed will get them, because they need people to hire. And because those who are getting hired will be taken out of poverty, there will be an increase of opportunity for all. The benefits of the free market. It's interesting to note that there's more evidence to suggest that an increase in welfare payments does more help than trickle-down economics does, because that increases the multiplier effect to a greater degree, because those who have more money at the lower end of society tend to spend more than those who are already wealthy. But the idea of trickle-down economics does not necessarily ensure that social stability will commence. It's just a promise made. So it's, in regards to supply-side economics and social stability and trickle-down economics, it's a contentious issue even today about the true aspects of how it deals with social stability. Some blame it for the rise in inequality. Others will come back. We're all doing better now. You have a tree with 4 apples, and I got 1 apple and you got 3. Now we have a tree with 9 apples. You get 4 and I get 5. Aren't you better off than you were before? And the answer is yes, but that still increases inequalities, and there are social problems that occur there. The welfare state. So the welfare state is an ideal. It's generally promoted by more left-wing members, and in regards to how it deals with productivity and debt, it is polluted with nationalization of industry. And that's one of its flaws in regards to being able to examine it. For example, the Labour Party from 1946 to 1951 transforms the economic sphere of Britain. 25% of industry was nationalized. You created suddenly a national health insurance scheme. General education provided at a massive benefit. There are school lunches for every kid. There is a rationing program to keep the debt low. And the Labour Party did keep the debt low through rationing, just as if the socialist parties did in countries where rationing existed. And it's mixed with the ideas of government intervention. The welfare state is summed up by the ideals of Antonin Brevon. He is a Welsh politician who is incredibly influential in this Labour Party in creating the welfare state. And he argued for the National Health Service by claiming that it was an economic right to citizenship. That where before the political struggles of the 1800s had created citizenship in regards to political affairs, this would create citizenship in an economic sense. And inequality does decline. Growth does occur, and there's a general rise in living standards, in education levels, in healthcare levels, in the social well-being of these people. Now, I'm going to use Sweden as my example of a welfare state. Sweden has generally, through the 1990s and the 1990s, Sweden reduced its role in the economy, and it's similar to the neoliberals, except that Sweden places a tremendous influence on social safety net that most liberal economies, such as Germany, do not. Sweden's debt load has a net debt of 9% because they still retain some assets in government, in foreign companies, and maintain assets in businesses that allow them to have only a total net debt of 9% of GDP. An incredibly low number, something that our country needs to analyze. But the IMF indicates that without these assets, they have a total debt of 41% of GDP. And the pension fund is going to continue an issue in Sweden as the population ages. But generally, you look at Norway and their giant oil trust fund that they've established that invests in companies from around the world. They have negative net to GDP. They have more assets than they have debt. You look at Denmark, it was only 50-60 range. You look at countries with this progressive that have managed to combine the welfare state with an efficient capitalist market, and they do incredibly well in regards to keeping debt load, because there's the constant fear that if you don't manage your debt properly, you'll have a spiraling deficit that you can't control. Other systems with a welfare state, such as France, for example, have a high deficit. Their debt is about 96% of GDP. That's before crisis. Everything's before crisis in these numbers. They have a high debt load. They have a pension system that is unfunded. And there is a high degree of state intervention and state regulations, high corporate taxes, and an inability for the private sector to truly flourish. And this is where it becomes controversial. How do you separate the welfare state from high debt loads and from state intervention? For regards to productivity, this is why I'm using Sweden again. Corporate taxes are only 21%. Local taxes range from 29 to 35%. Capital taxes are about 30%. And this has a toll on the average Swedish citizen. It's expensive, the tax system in Sweden. There's no inheritance tax, but these 29 to 35% tax rates decrease consumption. They decrease investment. When a lot of your taxes are based off of that, they're incredibly regressive. If it's not based off income tax, that means every item you buy, it decreases the ability for you to buy more. So your consumption declines in regards to other nations. Now, VAT taxes are an incredibly efficient way of gathering the funds that you need, and they're hard to evade, which is one reason tax evasion is also lower in these countries. But generally, the social safety net has provided most of the needs the Swedish people would possess, and it's incredibly popular. It's becoming incredibly efficient as they adopt different reforms, and Swedish people are generally willing to pay for it. It does cause economic pain to a certain degree, but Sweden is generally deregularized, and a lot of these countries have become startup nations. Sweden, with a population of only 10 million, has a higher GDP per capita than countries with much more populous nations, such as the UK, or France, or Spain, or Italy. Partly because that there is this lack of fear that if you start a company, you will go bankrupt. And there are benefits to this. It does not mean that it's a model worth replicating, because Sweden's history has gone through tumultuous change. And in the 1980s, their country almost went bankrupt because of the social and welfare state intervention. But it's stable. It's the longest lasting of many, and the longest lasting of the welfare states are the ones that combine successful capitalist enterprises with different national goals in regards to social well-being. It's can develop, unfortunately, in some cases, into patron politics, where politicians praise certain groups and promote their interests, and it creates a clash within society. But generally promotes a high level of income equality and social and well-being in regards to health and education. And those are goals that people are willing to accept in the society. And therefore, it's socially stable. In some examples, such as the Nordic states, they were able to keep a relatively stable GDP to debt ratio. And in regards to productivity, the greatest costs are tax rates and the fact that sometimes you might have an inducement not to work because you can gain more welfare benefits. But the evidence behind this is changes from study to study sometimes, and it's hard to pin down the exact economic pain caused by this. So concluding thoughts. In my opinion, the ordoliberals do the most suitable job of promoting economic growth, of promoting social well-being, of promoting innovation and discovery in a society. The ordoliberals do a splendid job of combining the welfare state with laissez-faire economics. They don't believe in monopolies. There's no fear of a company arising through its virtue to become the most prosperous and then corrupting itself to a point where it's no longer the most efficient or the most productive. It's just exploiting the wages because they have a dominant share in the marketplace. In the German example, there is a strong bank that prevents inflation. The German economy is based on the fact that everything is stable, and therefore there's room for planning. If you can plan, it helps create economic goals you as an individual can meet. And the more economic goals you can meet as an individual, the more you can plan for, the more everyone else can plan for. And if you prevent monopolies, there's an equal chance of opportunity. Inequality is generally lower in Germany because there's a genial relationship between employee and employer, because people know that when a company fails, the government usually does not bail them out unless the government caused the reason for the failure. Or it does not, if a company harms the community, they pay for it. It's a system of fairness. So it prevents the rise of monopolies. The government is genuinely restrained, and there's low income inequality, manipulations of the market. There's a stable budget. There's an industrial system, stable currency, low inflation, strict government rules which are kept, unlike many systems. There's low corruption because of this. And even the best companies never become monopolies, which gives equal opportunity. There's an example of Volkswagen. Volkswagen is first created. It's the people's wagon. It's a nationalist tool used by the German military to promote domestic manufacturers. And people who ordered this car, actually, most of them never received it back in the 1930s because the Nazi government pocketed the money and then used it to promote economic well-being for their own benefit, for their own nationalist economy, which is suffering in debt due to all the war production it incurred. Most people who ordered a Volkswagen never got the Volkswagen. But when the company was privatized and it became a private actor, it had to compete against other companies. And eventually it emerged as one of the most successful the German automobile industry. And it's not the only one. BMW is another great example. The German automobile industry is efficient. And it's efficient because they rely on local distributors who produce high-quality products. It's efficient because they have cheap importation of foreign goods, because they have a stable system, and because there's no fear of social conflict in Germany to the degree there is in other countries. And it's the same for banking services, agriculture services, sector services. It doesn't necessarily mean that Germans haven't broken the trend in some cases. Their energy system is an interesting example of what happens when you don't follow an ordoliberal example, but you see it to promote environmental concerns, and it doesn't necessarily mean what they've done is not worth studying. It just means that it's not ordoliberal. They expect the government will prioritize stability, and this means that there's no inflation. You can save your money for retirement. You can invest without inflation crippling your savings. If the automobile industry were to, in some way, collapse in a form that a significant portion of society is hurt, it won't happen in the short term. There's fears in Germany it might happen in the long term with the trend towards electric. The German government can step in, and because of these manufacturers at a low level, they can adapt. They're free market individuals. The government can promote new factories, private markets can promote new factories, new forms of goods, new productive services, new kinds of vehicles that weren't created before. This can't be done with state companies. At least it can't be done with state companies that don't have the incentive to produce. And if it was to fail in the short term, the German government would support these rational actors to prevent them from falling into poverty, to prevent political extremism from rising. It preserves enough liberty to act as you wish. It preserves enough liberty that has prevented the rise of totalitarian state inside Germany after all the tumultuous affairs, after the division, of the country, after the re-emergence, after the re-establishing of a capitalist system and a communist system of East Germany. There is individual liberty and there's stability. Now, I believe that the process can be replicated in the United States. I believe it will be a tumultuous process, and it'll be quite arduous. But I believe it can be done. The first thing that needs to be done is establish a stable level of government spending. Now, whether this means securing in the short term that the government priorities in social spending is cut or taxes are raised, either one must be done in order to secure financial solvency. In regards to productivity, monopolies do need to be broken up. There needs to be a system of education that generally promotes vocational studies and needs to promote in both industrial and service to create the best specialization skills possible. There needs to be stability and low inflation. Luckily, we have a strong independent central bank. We have a bank that promotes low inflation, strong currency. We have a social safety net, but it's not to the level that's necessary to promote both short-term economic recovery and long-term transformation. It's more. It's because of the nature of federalism. It's harder to administer because you're also counting on the success and failure of individual local governments. So, this process of debt, productivity, and social stability can never truly be replicated the same as one country to the next. But I do believe that as a concept, as a way of administering and organizing society, of all the economic types, ordoliberalism is both the best compromise among economists and the best way of organizing a stable society. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this.